Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Real Clear Values podcast. Today, it is my pleasure to be joined by Professor Simon Ball, who is Professor of International History and Politics at the University of Leeds. Simon, welcome to the Real Clear Values podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on, Tom.
I should also say, Simon, that you are also the author of this book, Death to Order, A Modern History of Assassination, which has been recently published through Yale. And it's a very interesting history on as it says, the modern history of assassination. So it doesn't go way back into the annals of time, does it? It starts from a
No,
certain
no. I
period.
mean that was deliberate because I felt that quite often existing histories of assassination can get bogged down in um, other time periods, which are interesting in their own right. But as the historian saying goes, the past is a foreign country. They
Mm,
do things differently there. So I posited the beginning of an age of modern assassination
mm.
with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, and the book takes it from there. Uh, and takes it up to the attempted assassination of Donald Trump in 2024. So
Mm.
110 years of assassination.
Yeah, yeah, fascinating. So why did you decide to write the book then, Simon? Why assassination in particular?
Uh, I, I stumbled into it as curiosity based research. My original research was on small arms control because I was interested in arms control, and I was doing a side project on Britain's small arms control, really. And I came across the papers of a very obscure body, the 1917 Islington Committee, Lord Islington being in the chair, which was a British government inquiry about limiting arms control after the expected end of the Great War, which is what they were fighting. And during that, they had various witnesses, one of whom was Sir Mark Sykes, who is best known for two things. One being the signatory of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which carved up the Middle East during the First World War, or arguably did that. And secondly, dying from the flu at the end of the First World War. And his body was subsequently used in medical research. But in between those two events, he was in London and he gave testimony, and he said, with one of these devilish weapons, by which he meant semi-automatic pistols, any fool could assassinate a viceroy or a police inspector. So I thought that was interesting. And I thought, okay, sort of when I have time, I will try and investigate whether that was in fact true, whether his characterization in 1917 was accurate. Of course, it was rather more complex than that. And so that's how I started. And at a certain point in the process, long before I thought of turning it into a book, you have to think, do I really want to write about this subject? And it's a grim subject, but I thought it was historically interesting. I thought there are many gaps which needed to be filled and which I could do, and I thought was important. So it was possible to override my initial qualm.
Yeah, interesting, interesting. So you've mentioned a bit already about the period that you cover in the book, the period of assassination. Is there a particular type of assassination that you're focusing on here? Is it just, state against state? Is it more minor players than that?
Yes and no. It's because the argument of the book, we can get into what constitutes an assassination or not, but just talking generally, the argument of the book is that it's states that make assassination important. Now, that does not mean that the states are responsible for assassination, though sometimes they certainly are, and there's plenty of state-sponsored or indeed direct state assassination in the book. But that's not always so. But in my view, more importantly, states have to respond to assassination, not least because the leaders of those states might be threatened. So they will, at some level, respond. And it's the response of the states, usually rather than the assassinations themselves, which reshape international relations. And that's why Franz Ferdinand is the start of something, because that is a state-sponsored assassination, Serbia being the state sponsor. But what's much more important than that, because Serbia had done this kind of thing before, is that the Austro-Hungarian Empire reacts, and it reacts in a very violent way by invading Serbia and through that triggering the First World War. So it's the reaction. So my way of selecting wasn't necessarily a sort of, this has to be an assassination, this is an assassination, this is a state assassination, that's not a state assassination. It was really archivally led, and I was interested in the assassinations that great powers in particular reacted to, and democratic great powers above all, reacted to, and that had some impact, or failed to react to, which is often the case, but for interesting reasons. It wasn't they are unaware, they just didn't want to react, and that's an interesting story. So as I went through the archives, I put the story together. So if it was important to one of the great, particularly democratic powers in the 20th and early 21st century, I was interested. If it wasn't, then it tended to be laid aside.
Yeah, yeah, that's fair enough, and completely makes sense. Like you say, you've got to have some sort of parameters in terms of what you're covering, because there's an awful lot of
Yeah,
assassination that happened in that particular period of time.
there are, but the usual parameters tend to be set deductively rather than inductively, i.e., that somebody comes up with a definition of assassination and then tries to fit their study into that definition.
Mm,
I didn't particularly do that.
mm, mm,
It's if a state thought it was assassination, or at least toyed with the idea it was assassination, even if it decided it wasn't, and reacted in interesting ways, then I was interested, rather than saying, this is my definition of assassination, and if it doesn't fit in this, I will walk away. So a
yeah.
different, yeah, very different intellectual approach.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting when you talk about definition or defining assassination, because you identify four common elements of assassination in the book, don't
Yeah,
you? So you've got, of course, you've got the first component is the procurer of the
yeah,
assassination, the assassin themselves, the second part. Then thirdly, you've got tools of the trade, and then fourthly, finally, you've got the cover up as well. So would you say
yes.
that that is generally a solid criteria in defining?
Yeah, but it's inductively reached.
Hmm,
I use as an example in the book a particular assassination, which is very well documented. So it's able
hmm,
to go into very precise detail about those four elements. But they are the four elements that, sort of studying
hmm,
lots and lots of assassinations, it's very likely that those four elements will exist. I mean, sort
hmm,
of, kind of an assassination. You know, if you're talking about assassination, it has to be, it is a subcategory of murder, but it can't. You can't just put every murder in it.
hmm,
And uh, states are usually interested in, is there a conspiracy? So a conspiracy is more than one person
hmm,
doing this, whether that is, the state themselves has a conspiracy within it, or kind of an external conspiracy. So you've got that, so it's not a lone wolf, except nominally. So lots of important assassinations, were called assassination, probably don't meet that criterion, but they're certainly important. So, classically, the Kennedy assassination of 1963, the JFK assassination, and indeed the RFK killing in 1968, are both referred to as assassinations, and the American state takes them very seriously and regards them as such. So there's no point, kind of me ex post facto coming on and say, oh no, well, they weren't really assassinations because it's unlikely that there was a conspiracy, even though there are lots of conspiracy theories involved with those, and there's a big difference. Kind of a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory are very different things. A conspiracy theory is untrue. Kind of, sort of, you don't need the theory bit on the end. If it's just a conspiracy, it truthfully was a conspiracy. So, kind of, you're not going to stop yourself as an historian looking at things which, the states themselves took very seriously.
Yeah, yeah. So, something else that's interesting in your approach in the book, Simon, you make pretty clear early on, is that you're not interested in counterfactuals. You're interested in the observable effects of assassination rather than these kind of what if imaginings of what if he or she hadn't been assassinated, or what if they had been assassinated, or whatever it is. You're quite keen to stick to the facts, aren't you?
I am, and it's because in this case the counterfactuals are so prevalent. Sort of. And what it does is it occludes proper historical investigation, because if you jump straight from the event to a series of counterfactuals about, what would have happened if they had died, the usual one, then it misses the fact that there were real historical events. States did analyze them, think about them, and do something. And you can, i.e., proper history, you can and that doing something had effects on those states and on the international system. So, sort of, not only I think is counterfactual history a bad procedure in general, it has been an incredibly poisonous procedure for the proper historical examination of assassination, because it just smothers out, or indeed removes the need for proper historical. If you can speculate, why do any proper investigation?
Well, that's a question for the day, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's much easier to speculate,
yes,
sort of, than it is to investigate, and
yeah,
so that was why I was even stronger than I would be normally on this topic, because it is, sometimes counterfactual history is ephemera, but in the case of assassination, it's a roadblock, and it needs to be removed before we can do anything particularly credible.
yeah, absolutely, and that's the word, isn't it? Credibility being key to the historian's process. So
Yes.
so besides the wading through and avoiding and negating counterfactual, Simon, what were the challenges in researching the history of assassination? Because I can imagine it's shrouded in secrecy, mystery, cover up, and all sorts of discarded evidence.
Yeah, I mean, that is both true and untrue. So, it's certainly the case that no archive you go to is going to give you the full story. But then again, historical archives usually don't give you the full story, even when they're talking about more innocent things than assassination. But yeah, I will concede that they probably, and at one point I came across a reader's notes. The person going through the file to take stuff out before it was released to the public, but they hadn't removed the notes, and I quote them, sort of in the book, sort of somewhere. Sometimes someone will find this interesting, but we're still going to suppress it, with regret, but we are going to suppress it. And uh, and so that is definitely the case. But on the other hand, it would be misleading to say that there isn't a huge amount of sort of what you might call standard archival evidence about assassination. Modern bureaucracies, and since we're dealing with the modern period, they all are bureaucracies. At the beginning of the period, they have typewriters. Now they have sort of even more advanced forms of copying and communication. They write things down. It's the nature of bureaucracy. They don't write everything down, but they write a lot of stuff down, and then they store it. And then a proportion of that makes its way into the public archives. So I should say that I didn't use anything which was not verifiable by other people. So at no stage, kind of was I in possession of secret or hidden evidence. I used private archives, private papers, but they are available for inspection, and I went and inspected them. So it's sort of quite often you get books, perhaps by journalists or official historians, which are based on evidence which is not verifiable. All the stuff in here, all the archival stuff in here, is you can go to the archive and read it, and of course someone might disagree with my interpretation of the words, but that doesn't mean it's not there. It is open to proper historical debate, i.e. other historians can, and without wishing to overstate it. And I was trying to do some kind of ice breaking here, not in the social sense, but in the ship sense of driving through some kind of difficult and knotty stuff and saying, look, there is plenty here. So there's no excuse for not investigating properly, or kind of I've opened it up, you'll find something different. These archives are voluminous.
Yeah. So thinking about that ship analogy there, Simon, in terms of when you were moving the ship forward to break the ice, what surprised you most in the research that you've done on the history of assassination?
Well, I'm not sure it surprised me, because I wondered if this was the case, and then indeed there is a kind of theoretical literature on it. But what I came to understand was that there was a profound change in Western states, and it happened in the 1980s. And through the archives, you can see that change happening. You can see people discussing it, and the change is nothing to do with state-sponsored assassination or kind of states carrying out assassinations. It is to do with the building of a very secretive security machinery around the leaders of democracies. Now, we see the US Secret Service, but the US federal so-called protection community has, I think, currently over 150 member organizations. So the Secret Service is but the most famous. We see it on telly, but each state, Western state, has its own kind of national traditions, but they're all actually very similar under the skin, and they're all linked up. And the effect of this, and the people who designed the systems knew it would be the effect, so that was a kind of interesting archival thing, is that it is going to hive off a class of people which are using Indian terminology would call very, very important people. So these are people with state protection and permanent state protection. And they are almost a different caste from the rest of us. And the person who understood this perfectly and has illustrated it usefully is Prince Harry. Because Prince Harry, through his court cases, he knows that he's not important unless he has state security. So if you haven't got it, you're not important. He hasn't got it, he's not important. He wants it. So whatever his motivations, expressed or implicit, kind of he's been a rather useful illustration of the point I was trying to make. But the problem is that state security system, or those state security systems, although they keep popping up in the archives, and you can get some, quite a lot, they are much harder to get to than understanding assassinations. Sort of the archives are much richer on kind of assassination conspiracies and investigations and assassinations and revelations about assassinations than they are about security, because if for the latter case you're not dealing with redacted files, you're either dealing with files which have been withheld by the state, i.e. they are known to exist and they exist in plentiful measure, but they have, they've just been retained and not released into the public domain, or they don't even bother to say that they exist. But since it's an extensive and important bureaucracy, and this is one of the things that Prince Harry has done for us, he revealed RAVEC, which is the committee, the British committee, which decides who's going to be protected, and some of its subsidiary organisations. I mean, that had to be dragged out of the state. The very existence of a body which was essentially saying, you're important, you're not very important, and you're not important at all. And that's the, so that was the, certainly for the latter part of the book, that was the, if not surprising, then the kind of difficult investigation which had to be done.
Yeah, that is interesting. And it's interesting how these sort of court cases, especially involving someone with the celebrity of Prince Harry, has really brought this information to bear.
Yeah, but even then, it's very, kind of, they're very unforthcoming. Most
Yeah.
of that court case took place in Canberra.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting. There's a phrase actually that you use in the book, which I think is fascinating, about the significance of assassination. So you write that assassination is the actual exercise of power in international politics. So what would you say, in summary, assassination reveals about the nature of power and those who wield it?
Well, I mean, the first thing is I just mentioned the creation of this separate caste. It reveals that, earlier in the piece, I mean, it reveals various things, but on the same theme, sort of earlier in the 20th century, states on the whole regarded assassination as part of the price of doing business. So, particularly imperial states, they just accepted that their functionaries were going to be assassinated from time to time, and that they shouldn't overreact to that. So that was I suppose kind of what it revealed. It also reveals that the inner workings of the state, So to go back to Sykes, he said, a police inspector or a viceroy, could be killed by easily by semi-automatic pistol. But although a viceroy is nearly assassinated, and there are lots of attempts, but none is actually assassinated. But in many ways, you can always replace a viceroy who is kind of technically Queen's or King's representative in India, and sort of ruler of British India. But you can always get another one of those. But police inspectors and their intelligence networks are really important, and they're hard to replace. And that's certainly true of the earlier period. I suspect it's true of the current period as well.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. So if assassination is built into the way of doing things, whether then or now,
Yeah.
how is it or how has it been that states justify assassination to themselves and or to their citizens?
Right. So, well, they don't justify it very often. They kind of historically they've just tried to cover up the fact that they're doing it. Sort of it's been revealed in different ways. To go back to the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Serbia, kind of denied blind that they had anything to do with the assassination in 1914. The Austro-Hungarians couldn't prove it in 1914. In 1918, the great powers in the War Guilt Clause of Treaty of Versailles actually said, it was a small group of terrorists, nothing to do with Serbia. So they gave Serbia a clean bill of health. And then it was non-state to a certain extent, or German state in another element of the story, who really uncovered the plot by 1930. So from 1930 onwards, most people with interest knew that the Serbians had been behind it. So you see these sort of things not justifying it. The other technique, and this is more internally focused, is a word which people actually use within the intelligence community, but it's not much used, kind of in common speech, which is synecdoche, which is a word which means allowing the whole to take the part of the detail, or the detail taking the part of the whole. And so when the CIA investigates itself in the late 1960s, it uses this word to say, well, nobody actually discussed assassination in the documents. Kind of plainly, we were assassinating people. That we, the Inspector General of the CIA, are investigating ourselves. This is a secret investigation. It comes public later, but at the time they thought it was highly secret. And it's just folded in under sabotage, or another word, sort of, kind of sabotage of individuals, to use the Second World War. So you don't have to talk about it. You know about it. But latterly, if you're talking in the 21st century, there's been a change of tack, first pioneered by the Israelis, then taken on by the Americans, but actually used by all major powers, definitely including the British, to say targeted killing isn't assassination. It's just to say, although we are planning and killing individuals, named individuals, deliberately, without any kind of judicial, even quasi-judicial process, we're doing it for raison d'etat. That's not assassination. And they can do that by playing around with these definitions. But who's going to rule? Which court is going to? There is no agreed international legal definition of assassination. No court is going to rule on this, and no internal court is going to rule on it either. Or if they do, there was a case in Israel in which the courts just upheld that and said, yeah, kind of we're killing individuals, but that's not assassination. So you sell it by, at least formally, by saying, yes, we are involved in targeted killing, but that's not assassination, because assassination is bad and illegal, and we don't do bad and illegal things. So there's, but sub rosa, I mean, the other way is just to celebrate it. Sort of, and you've seen this in the American cases. Okay, they've said these are not assassinations, but here's some photographs of the president and his key advisors watching somebody, an named individual, being deliberately killed, and then whoa, kind of, we got him. So you see that with Obama in the case of Osama bin Laden. You see it with Trump, Qasem Soleimani. So from time to time, sort of you get this, and in the case of the Israelis, it's usually kind of Mossad officers talking on and off the record and boasting about the number of, how they've killed lots of people. And there's a constituency for that. Sort of, it seems to work. So there are a number of ways through which you can, to use your term, sell it to your population.
Yeah. So selling it to the population's one thing. Selling it to yourself, so to speak, is another. There's another quote from the book that I'd like to share, which I think again is fascinating. It really gets the heart of assassination, which reads: "The study of assassination is akin to running a razor blade down the history of international politics. The cut is narrow but long and deep. Assassination reveals statesmen and their servants at their most authentically vulnerable moments. They are, after all, often the people with the most to lose."
They are. Because when you're studying international politics, the history of international politics, and you're studying elite policy making, some of it, is very crunchy stuff, and these are, nobody's saying these aren't major decisions, but the people making the decisions are probably the least at risk from any decision which is made. When you make a foreign policy decision, or even, sometimes a decision about war and peace, the people who are going to suffer are not you. Sort of, or at least you don't think that it's going to be you. In some cases, a revolution occurs, and it becomes very much a problem. But by and large, nobody makes these decisions thinking they are potentially at risk. And when they talk about risks, for instance, when you're talking about something else I've studied, which is kind of nuclear strategy and nuclear planning, kind of the command and control of a nation could be wiped out. But there is an element of this is theoretical. Kind of the risks, are massive, but it's unlikely to happen. Whereas assassination, it is happening, and kind of, it's not something which is in the realm of the theoretical, and it is something which can bite back and affect the leaders of states, which is one of the reasons why their major response to assassination, and there are many levels on which states respond, is to start protecting themselves, which is kind of very different from trying to protect your population, for instance, from a threat of terrorism. I mean, sort of, we as we do this recording, there's a story about an attack on a train from Doncaster to London. May or may not be terrorism, doesn't look like it is. I've travelled on that line many times, and I suspect you have as well. So it's real, and there was a response to it. But let's face it, nobody who is classified as being actually important was ever going to be on that train unless it was for a photo op. The kind of the sort of the people at risk from terrorism or from kind of violence of various kinds, random violence, are people in the street. Decision makers are not people in the street once they reach a certain level. They are special. So however man of the people or woman of the people some would like to appear, they're not. Because there's nothing like, sort of a 24/7 protection team. And we saw this, kind of with the former president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy. He's sent to prison, and they have to make arrangements within the prison to have his protection team with him in the prison. Nothing says I am not normal more than having a state protection team babysitting you during your prison sentence.
Quite. That's very interesting. So, just going back to the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Simon, you mentioned in the book that this is a point at which things change in terms of the history of assassination. Things are different after this point. How would you summarize the differences that come about after that assassination?
Well, there are two differences which occur, which are both important. One, every decision maker has to accept, even if they didn't want to, certainly by 1930, that kind of assassination is can be state sponsored or can be state assassination, and we're not talking about obscure states where we're talking about states which are part, in that case, of the concert of Europe, sort of recognized and are important in some level. So it's not going to be anarchists or any other form of revolutionary, i.e. small groups which have nothing to do with any state. It's just not. And secondly, the consequences of the assassination were so enormous, as I say, essentially the collapse of four empires, that nobody can afford to completely dismiss any given assassination. Doesn't mean that they might still say, okay, we can afford to ignore this one, but you can't do that as a knee-jerk reaction. The state has to have ways of thinking about assassination. It has to take it seriously. And so, states after 1914 and their leaders accept that assassination is a phenomenon of states, and they are going to have to take it seriously, even if the taking it seriously involves not doing anything.
Yeah. So it's a proverbial game changer, isn't it? In a very real sense, where people have to states people have to factor in that this is a thing now, and that it can have very real consequences. So just thinking about those consequences, then, Simon, another distinction that you highlight in the book is the impact that an assassination has in a stable democracy versus a failing state. What are some of the distinctions that you would pull out there?
Well, the kind of a lot of the political science literature, the bulk of it, I would say, is about failing and failed states. So they lack things. So to go to the Weberian definition of how a state, successful state works, it has the monopoly of legitimate violence within a given territory. Kind of failed and failing states don't have a defined territory often, because they have no legitimacy and they have no monopoly on the use of violence. And so in those states, they might be relying on warlords or charismatic leaders, who are shaping how those states develop, or indeed if they survive or not. And so the removal of such an individual can be important. That's really not what the book is about. The book is about states which do have the monopoly of legitimate violence in a given territory. I mean, they're internationally recognized, they have a bureaucracy, they have functioning armed forces, functioning police forces, functioning court systems, functioning press, all those hallmarks of what we would probably call liberal democracy as it developed in certain countries in the 20th century. And so they're not going to collapse. That's just not going to happen. It's not that you remove one person or series of people and the thing falls apart, because that's not how these states work. They are impersonal. They are very resilient in the face of the removal of a few, or in some cases, many individuals. However, it doesn't mean they don't change. It doesn't mean that they don't have foreign policies, because they do, that those foreign policies can't be affected by assassination, because they are. And it doesn't stop them reorganizing themselves internally, even if in secret. And it doesn't stop their political culture from being changed. This is very rarely in the way that assassinations plan. It's not, assassin has a political cause. They want to further it. They kill somebody. Everything. Quite often, it has no effect on that cause, or indeed a negative. But that doesn't mean that an assassination, or more likely a series of assassinations, i.e. either compact in time, but plenty of them, or a number over a time series, doesn't change how states are. And I think assassination has changed how Western states are.
Would you say that there are key differences between how Western states use assassination versus states in the East Asia, Southeast Asia, the global South? Are there distinct differences between?
There are differences, but the differences are largely in the capability to absorb and react to assassination. The mechanics of assassination are no different, between different, sort of go back historically in the kind of 1920s, 30s, you had the phenomenon of totalitarian assassination. The way that a totalitarian country would go about assassinating people is not particularly different from what democratic states picked up. And one of the things that I say that the key changeover is 1942, when various Western intelligence agencies during the Second World War say, well, actually, the totalitarians are probably onto something. This is a useful technique which we should bureaucratize. It wasn't that individuals in Western state bureaucracies hadn't had their fingers stickily in assassination, not often, but previously. But we should have organisations which should do it. It should be an option which is always on the table for a state leadership. So the effects may be very different, but the assassinations are rarely very different. I mean, go back to Sykes again. His whole point was that everybody's got. You can remember semi-automatic pistols are a very new technology. The first, kind of fully functional mass-produced example was 1896. So if you were talking in 1917, it's about, like I was talking about drones. It's a bit of high tech 20 years ago, and now it's a bit of tech that everybody's got.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, how would you say then, in view of more recent technological advancements, assassination has evolved from the 20th century going into the 21st century?
In some ways, it hasn't massively evolved. To take the Trump assassination, so some attempt, somebody took a shot at him from a roof with a rifle. Sort of this, kind of a rifle as it happens, which was developed in the 1950s, the type of rifle. Um, Sort of it's not what you would call high tech in any way. But if you're talking about and sort of the explosive, using explosives in assassination, there was a kind of revolution, in technical revolution in that, just because up until the 1970s, explosives were a very bad option if you wanted to actually assassinate somebody. They were often used, and killed a lot of people, but usually missed the target. Not always, but could go back to Franz Ferdinand. There was a bomb and a semi-automatic pistol. The pistol killed Franz Ferdinand. The bomb injured some people in the street. And that's how it tended to be until 1970s on. Those things remain in place. I mean, with the layer which has gone on top has been a kind of drone technology, but really the technology is guided missile technology. What drones do is enable you to carry out operations without risking air crew, which can be important. That's the only advantage a drone has over a manned aircraft, really, and they're also cheaper. But the real things behind drones or aircraft or helicopters or whatever you're using is an intelligence system, and the intelligence system makes you think, oh well, kind of spies, and yes, that does exist. But as much as anything, it's geospatial intelligence, which is, can you locate an individual in a particular point on the Earth, or signals intelligence? Can you intercept and then decrypt communications from individuals who usually don't want to be found? And that requires a lot of effort, to be at the cutting edge of geospatial and signals intelligence is what kind of marks out highly capable states. And it's no kind of secret or surprise that kind of Britain's kind of most important alliance is the so-called Five Eyes alliance, with the United States and Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, which has been going since 1946 in various, it's that which is important. Laying your hands on a few drones is not particularly challenging. Now, it would have
Yeah.
been 20 years ago when it was cutting edge technology. It's not cutting edge technology now.
Yeah. So it's more about the network's information than
Yeah,
the technology used to execute or the
yeah,
tools of the trade,
and
so to speak.
yeah, and sort of a lot of this is literally hardwired. You need the installations and aircraft and satellites and all that stuff to do this. But the point is about assassination, you don't need any of that really. Kind of it's particularly useful for the states who already had those networks in place, and then they could plug the technology into the, there were teething difficulties as the Americans themselves admitted in the first decade of the 20th century. We weren't really very good at this. It took us time to do, to integrate everything and develop. You could say it was actually quite a short time. I don't know, about 2002 to 2008. But it wasn't quite as easy as they thought. So that's an option for those kind of states. But all the old methods remain, kind of a potential choice if one hasn't got access to those high tech methods.
Yeah, interesting. So, what do you intend to be the key takeaways from the book Death to Order then?
Follow the state. Kind of look at states, but not in that assassination conspiracy way. Oh, they were behind this particular assassination. Kind of look how they genuinely react, not some kind of counterfactual dream world of what would have happened. So for us now, it would be please look at the security systems of very, very important people, because in many ways they have and are still defining the course of our democracies. And we don't know very much about them. It's very hard to discover things about them. And it's something which needs a great deal more investigation. And if Death to Order, makes a step in the right direction and opens up the field, it will have done its job.
Fantastic. So we need to look out for very, very important people, who they are and what they're all about, and how they get on the list, etc. So that's
and how it affects them,
yes,
and everybody else around them.
yeah, yeah. Would you say that that's a key component of maintaining a healthy democracy then?
Kind of discovering what those systems are and talking about them openly. I don't think having the systems is actually a sign of an unhealthy democracy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The transparency is what I'm referring to. Yeah, in terms of a
Yeah.
healthy
Oh,
democracy. Yeah, yeah,
absolutely. Let's not be naive about some of the practical challenges. You can see why states don't want to talk about their security systems. But if you take certain things and say the people can't know about this, then the people are going to be rightly suspicious of their leaders. And also, it changes the relationships even within the political elite, because it means that the VVIPs become much closer to their security bureaucracy than more junior politicians, aka MPs or similar, and you get this phenomenon which is continuing at the moment. You can see it in virtually every Western democracy, is that people lower down the food chain politically, who are politicians but more junior, want to scramble to get into the security system. So there's been a massive expansion of the security offered to members of Congress in the United States. Sort of kind of MPs in Britain are agitating, constantly to be brought within the security system. The same is true, for instance, in Germany, where there's some literature on it, and I'm sure it's true elsewhere as well. And so, if you've got more junior politicians as well clamoring to get into the VVIP club, again, that's not a particularly healthy sign. It's not about addressing a problem for everybody. It's about addressing a problem for a small elite, and sort of that really isn't very healthy for liberal democracy.
Indeed not. So, what's next, Simon? What are you researching beyond assassination?
Well, I'm thinking. I mean, I've just published a book, so there won't be anything in the
Give
very
you a breather, eh?
well, sort of. But I am thinking about a broader project and what I've just been talking about. That sort of kind of opening out into other things, phenomenon which have tended to distance the political elite from their own electorates and the implications of that, but not, which includes assassination, but not primarily focused on assassination.
That sounds like a very fascinating and, again, timely project. Simon
No,
Ball, thank you so much for your time on the Real Clear Values podcast.
been a real pleasure, Tom. Thank you very much for having me.